"Boss, it's an honor to have you dine here as a guest." That's what the chef said in front of my wife's entire family, mid-laugh, mid-toast to my humiliation. The silence that followed lasted longer than anything they'd planned for that night. My name is Wisdom James. I'm 38 years old, and I own 6 restaurants across Charlotte, North Carolina, including the one my in-laws had just chosen for what they were calling my goodbye dinner. 12 years ago, I was flipping burgers out of a food truck parked outside a community college, saving every spare dollar in a coffee can under my bed. Nobody believed a black kid from a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side would ever own property in this city, let alone a stretch of it. But I did. Quietly. Deliberately. And almost nobody in my wife's family knew the truth. That was by design. I married Rachel Wisdom 7 years ago, back when I was still building, still sleeping 4 hours a night, still driving a car with 200,000 miles on it because I refused to touch my reinvestment fund. Her family took one look at my beat-up Honda and decided everything about me. Her father, Harold, called me the cook at every holiday dinner since. Her mother, Deborah, once asked Rachel, in front of me, if she was embarrassed to bring me to her cousin's wedding. I let it slide. I told myself success would speak eventually, and when it did, I wanted to see their faces without a dollar sign clouding the moment. I didn't expect the moment to arrive wrapped in humiliation. The text came on a Tuesday. Rachel's name lit up my phone screen while I was signing off on inventory reports in my office above Averill House. My newest acquisition, 18 months old, still smelling faintly of fresh paint and ambition. Family dinner Friday. Averill House. 7 p.m. It's time for a fresh start. Something about the phrasing sat wrong in my chest. Rachel didn't write like that. Someone had told her what to say. I stared at my own reflection in the black screen for a long moment before I typed back 3 words. "I'll be there." I had no idea I was about to sit at my own table as a stranger. The days before that dinner, I found myself replaying every slight I'd swallowed over 7 years of marriage. Harold once introduced me to his golf buddies as Rachel's husband. He's in food service. The same year I closed on my 3rd location. Deborah sent a card for my birthday that read, "Hope this year brings clarity," as if I were lost, not building an empire in silence. Rachel's sister, Monique, liked to ask at every gathering whether I was still doing the truck thing, long after the trucks became 4 dining rooms with white tablecloths. I never corrected them. Not out of shame, but out of something closer to a test I hadn't admitted to myself yet. I wanted to know if they could ever see me as more than a punchline before the money made it obvious. Rachel knew the scope of what I'd built, the LLCs, the property deeds, the payroll for over 200 employees, but she rarely spoke of it to her family. At first I thought it was privacy. Lately I'd started to wonder if it was something closer to shame, running in the opposite direction than I'd assumed. 6 months ago, at a smaller dinner in Deborah's cramped dining room, I'd watched Harold mock my food truck days to a table of relatives, unaware he was mocking a man who owned the building his own accountant's office sat in. I said nothing. I ate my overcooked chicken and smiled and drove home in silence, Rachel's hand cold on the console between us. That night, lying awake, I told myself the truth would surface on its own terms, in its own time, and that patience was a kind of dignity. I didn't yet know that Rachel's family was already planning something, that Monique had been making calls, that Harold had already booked a restaurant and a story to go with it. I didn't know that "fresh start" was code for something designed to break me in front of witnesses. I just knew Friday was coming, and some old instinct, the same one that told me to save every dollar in that coffee can, was telling me to pay attention. Friday arrived cold and clear, the kind of Charlotte evening where the sky goes violet just before the streetlights flicker on. I got to Averill House 20 minutes early, a habit left over from my food truck years, when being late meant losing a lunch rush and losing a lunch rush meant not making rent. I parked in the back, near the loading dock, out of old routine, and killed the engine. That's when I saw them. Monique and Harold stood near the side entrance, half hidden by the valet stand, heads bent together in a way that read as conspiratorial, even through a closed car window. I rolled it down an inch, more out of instinct than intention. Fragments reached me on the wind. "He won't even see it coming," Monique said, and Harold laughed low, the kind of laugh that isn't really about humor. I sat frozen, my hand still on the ignition, replaying the sentence until it lost its shape. He won't even see it coming. See what coming? A part of me wanted to believe it was about a surprise gift, a happy occasion dressed up as this so-called fresh start. But the tone was wrong. There was no warmth in it. It was the tone of people who'd rehearsed something. Monique glanced toward the parking lot then, and I ducked my head half a second too late. Her eyes caught the shape of my car, and the conversation stopped like someone had cut the sound entirely. Harold straightened his jacket. Monique smoothed her dress. They walked inside without another word between them, and I sat there another full minute, my pulse loud in my own ears. I thought about calling Rachel right then, asking her plainly what was going on. My hand hovered over the phone. But something told me that if I asked, she'd only give me the version they wanted me to hear. So I put the phone away, straightened my own jacket, and walked toward the door of my own restaurant like a guest in someone else's plan. Inside, the hostess podium sat empty. I'd have to speak with Antoine later about staffing gaps on a Friday night, but the dining room was already half full of familiar faces. Rachel's family gathered around the long table near the windows, the one usually reserved for anniversaries and engagement dinners. Nobody stood when I walked up. That should have told me everything. I was seated at the far end, 3 chairs away from Rachel, who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Harold sat at the head of the table, like a man presiding over a courtroom. He waited until the wine had been poured, until every fork sat untouched beside every plate, and then he stood, tapping his glass with a knife in a gesture too formal for a family dinner. "Tonight," he said, "is a goodbye dinner." He let the words hang there, savoring them. We've all watched Rachel carry more than her share in this marriage. So Deborah and I took the liberty of setting something up. He slid an envelope across the table toward me. Inside was a printed confirmation for a job interview, a diner 2 states away, a line cook position, minimum wage listed in bold. "It's time you took something that fits," he said, "so Rachel can finally breathe." The table laughed. Actual laughter, easy and unbothered, like this was a toast and not a small execution. Deborah dabbed her eyes, more from delight than emotion. Monique smirked into her wine glass. I looked at Rachel. She stared at her napkin, refolding it into smaller and smaller squares, saying nothing at all. I felt the old instinct rise in me, the one that had kept me quiet through years of small cuts, telling me to let this pass too, to smile and absorb it the way I'd absorbed everything else. But something in me had reached its limit that night. Quietly, without announcement, the way a support beam gives out long before the ceiling actually falls. I set the envelope down without opening it further, and I waited. Deborah leaned forward once the laughter died down, eager to add her own contribution to the evening's theater. "We've actually been planning this for months," she said, almost proud of the confession. "Ever since you missed Thanksgiving for that supposed business trip." She said supposed the way you'd say a word you didn't believe applied to anything real. That sentence landed harder than Harold's envelope. Missed Thanksgiving. That had been the trip to Atlanta, closing on my 5th property, sitting in a lawyer's office until 11 at night reviewing zoning permits while my phone buzzed uselessly in my pocket with texts I was too deep in signatures to answer. I remembered apologizing to Rachel for hours afterward. I remembered her saying it was fine. It hadn't been fine. It had been evidence, apparently, filed away and presented to a jury of relatives who'd already reached their verdict. "We think," Deborah continued, glancing at Harold for backup, "that you've been telling stories about this whole restaurant thing. No offense, but a man doesn't miss holidays for a job that doesn't exist." She smiled like she'd solved something. Around the table, heads nodded in slow, satisfied agreement, as if they were finally rescuing Rachel from a lie she'd been too kind to see through herself. I looked at Rachel again. This time she looked back, just for a second, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not embarrassment, not even guilt exactly, but fear. Under the table, I reached for her hand without thinking, an old reflex from easier years, and I felt it trembling before she pulled it away, tucking both hands into her lap like she was hiding evidence of her own. Nobody at that table had any idea what was about to walk out of the kitchen. I almost felt sorry for them, the way you feel sorry for someone standing too close to a wave they haven't noticed yet. The kitchen doors swung open just as Harold was refilling his wine glass, mid-sentence about how some people just aren't built for real responsibility. Antoine Delacroix walked out in his whites, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the same calm authority he carried every night. He ran my kitchens into the ground with precision. He didn't go to Harold, though Harold had clearly requested the visit, hoping for some validating word from the chef about his son-in-law's diminished prospects. Antoine walked straight past him. He came to me. "Boss," he said, extending his hand with the easy familiarity of 18 months working under my ownership. "It's an honor to finally have you dine here as a guest instead of walking the floor before service." He shook my hand firmly, the way he always did, and glanced around the table with polite confusion at the sudden silence that had swallowed the room whole. Nobody moved. Harold's wine glass hovered an inch from his lips, forgotten mid-air. Deborah's mouth stayed open around a word she never finished. Monique's fork clattered softly against her plate, the only sound in a room that had gone airless. Rachel was the only one who didn't look surprised, and that, more than anything Antoine had just said, told me she'd known all along exactly who I was and had simply never told her family the truth. Antoine, sensing something he couldn't name but recognized as delicate, gave a small professional nod. "I'll have the kitchen send out the tasting portions whenever you're ready," he said, and disappeared back through the swinging doors, leaving behind a table full of people rearranging everything they thought they understood about the man they just tried to send away with a diner job 2 states over. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch as long as it needed to. "Boss," Harold repeated eventually, testing the word like it might dissolve if he said it wrong. I set my glass down. "Averill House is mine," I said. "Has been for a year and a half. Along with 5 other restaurants across this city. I didn't tell you because I wanted to see how you'd treat me without a number attached to my name." The table went quiet in a different way now, the kind of quiet that comes from recalculating everything at once. I told them about the food truck, the coffee can under my bed, the 400-square-foot apartment I'd lived in through my late 20s while reinvesting every dollar I made. I told them I'd tested this before, 6 months earlier at Deborah's house, when Harold mocked my food truck days to a table full of relatives, unaware he was insulting a man who owned the building where his own accountant kept an office 2 floors above the parking garage he complained about weekly. I wanted to believe family didn't need a balance sheet to show respect, I said. I wanted that to be true more than I wanted to be right. Harold's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Deborah reached for her water like it might steady something inside her. Monique stared at her plate, refusing to look up, and I understood in that moment that whatever she'd said in that parking lot, he won't even see it coming, had been about the diner job, not about this. They'd walked into their own ambush without knowing the layout of the building. I wasn't angry yet, not fully. I was somewhere colder than anger, somewhere I hadn't visited before. I looked at Rachel one more time, waiting for her to say something, anything, in my defense. She still said nothing, and that silence told me more than any confession could have. It was Rachel who finally broke, not out of loyalty to me but out of the collapsing weight of her own silence. "I knew," she said quietly, then louder, like she needed the whole table to hear the confession she'd been carrying. "I knew what tonight was supposed to be. Mom convinced me you were failing, that the late nights meant something else, maybe someone else, and I let myself believe her because it was easier than trusting you. I felt something crack open in my chest, quiet and total. You forwarded my calendar to your father," I said. It wasn't a question. I'd found the message 3 weeks earlier, buried in a shared cloud account we'd set up years ago for scheduling date nights, back when we still had those. Every late meeting, every property walkthrough, every lawyer's office I'd sat in until midnight, handed over to a man who used it as ammunition to convince his own daughter her husband was a liar. Rachel's face crumbled, but I didn't reach for her hand this time. Deborah opened her mouth to defend her daughter, then closed it again, perhaps finally understanding the size of what her manipulation had cost. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor in a room that had gone utterly silent, waiting on me the way a courtroom waits on a verdict. I didn't have a speech ready. I'd spent years rehearsing patience, not confrontation, and I found I had nothing left to say to any of them that would matter more than simply leaving. I straightened my jacket, the same one I'd worn getting out of the car 20 minutes before Monique and Harold had whispered about a coming that never came the way they'd planned it. Rachel reached for my sleeve as I turned. I let her fingers brush the fabric and fall away. I caught Antoine's eye across the room, and he came over immediately, reading something in my face that told him this wasn't a night for tasting portions. "The check," I said quietly. "For this table. Full price. No comp." Restaurant policy waived the bill for my table automatically, every night, without exception, one of the few perks I rarely used. Tonight, I wanted no part of that generosity extended to the people who'd spent an envelope's worth of money trying to humiliate me out of my own marriage. "Charge it to the card on file for the reservation," I told him. Harold's card. The one he'd used to book his own son-in-law's send-off dinner. Antoine returned minutes later with a black leather folder, setting it down in front of Harold without a word, professional as ever, though I caught the flicker of understanding in his eyes. Harold stared at the total like it might rearrange itself into something smaller. His hand hovered over his wallet, the same hesitation I imagined he'd felt composing that diner job offer, except this time there was no laughter waiting to follow it. "This is the last meal I'll share with any of you," I said, loud enough for the whole table, not just Harold. Deborah's face had gone pale. Monique wouldn't look up from her lap. Rachel had started crying quietly, the kind of crying that comes too late to change anything. Around us, other diners had begun to notice the stillness at our table, the particular tension that draws eyes without anyone meaning to look. The restaurant's lights seemed to dim by a fraction, though I knew it was only my own perception narrowing the room down to this one moment, this one table, this one closing chapter of 7 years. I didn't wait for anyone to respond. I turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the night had turned colder, rain starting to needle down against the windshield as I sat in my car in the same spot I'd parked in an hour earlier, back when I still believed this dinner might be exactly what Rachel's text had promised. I called my lawyer from the parking lot, my voice steadier than I expected, and told her to begin drafting separation paperwork. She didn't ask questions. She'd represented my business interests for years and had learned not to be surprised by much. I sat there afterward, engine idling, watching the restaurant's windows glow gold against the wet dark, my own restaurant, built from nothing but a coffee can and a stubborn refusal to quit. I thought about all the years I'd spent shrinking myself smaller at that family's table, trading dignity for a piece that had never actually existed, just a longer fuse on the same explosion. I thought about Rachel's face when she said she knew. I thought about how long she must have carried that knowledge, how long she'd chosen her mother's version of me over the truth she lived with every day. I put the car in reverse and pulled out of the lot, the city lights blurring gold and red through the rain-streaked glass, Charlotte stretching out ahead of me the way it had when I was 26 and certain of nothing except the next shift. My phone buzzed as I merged onto the highway. A voicemail, from a number I didn't recognize. I let it play through the car speakers, distracted, expecting a wrong number. It was Monique's voice, quieter than I'd ever heard it, almost afraid. "We need to talk," she said. "There's something about tonight you don't know yet. Something Mom did that even Dad doesn't know about." I turned the volume up, and the rain kept falling. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories.